What if I told you that while Mayor Michelle Wu keeps on boasting about Boston being the safest major city in America, the reality is boots on the ground and the data paints a different picture? What if I also told you that her sanctuary policies are draining resources? They continue to put public safety at risk. And it's really leading Boston down a path of financial uncertainty. Today, let's go over some of the facts regarding her speech. I want to give you my opinion on some of these things. First of all, Boston, as you know, is a sanctuary city, and Mayor Wu sees this as a perceived victory for human rights. But whose rights exactly? Whose rights are we talking about here? Because I don't think it's all human rights. How does that translate to public safety and local resources? You know, I think the facts are pretty clear, and I also think the facts speak for themselves. ICE has arrested undocumented immigrants in Boston charged with violent crimes, including child sex offenses, drugs, guns, so on and so forth. And this is, of course, after local officials released them onto the streets despite federal detainers. And of course, they weave their way around these things. They weave their way around. You know, some people are harmless, okay? But there are people out there that are not. Some are serious criminals, and they are allowed to roam free. And what happens is the news emphasizes the unintended consequences. Let's say when a legally present individual is mistakenly detained. This happens. This is called collateral damage. But what they do is they conveniently ignore the harm inflicted by the violent criminals. That is a clear double standard. And on top of that, Massachusetts has already spent over $1 billion on migrant shelters, over $1 billion. And based on projections that I looked at, that may reach around $1.8 billion in the next 2 years. So where's that money coming from, you ask? It's coming from you if you live in Boston. And Wu's policies, you know, on a surface level, she makes it sound compassionate, but they are obviously one-sided. They're compassionate to some, but not all. And the people who are paying the price are Boston's long-term residents, okay? Also, Mayor Wu keeps on claiming that Boston is the safest major city in America. I did a previous video on this, but I will tell you this much. The crime statistics, they tell a different story. So, you know, while homicides may be at, let's say, a historic low for the city, the data that they show, at least throughout the country, it's low. Homicides are down throughout the entire country. So is policing. On top of that, the police department in Boston is also understaffed. They're missing in the vicinity of like 200 to 250 plus officers based on their baseline. And their baseline is around 2,200 to 2,500, give or take. However, theft and shoplifting, all of that is skyrocketing. Shoplifting alone increased 30% in 2024. And that was reported by CBS Boston. The total crime in 2024 was around 26.19 per 1,000 residents, and that number includes a significant rise in nonviolent but disruptive crimes. Now, Boston's claim to safety is what I think is misleading, and because I think what they're doing is they're cherry picking some of that data. When you break apart the statistics, crime is low in more affluent neighborhoods. But if you start to dig deeper, the majority of the crime happens in a few certain neighborhoods. Hope that makes sense. Now, Wu just mainly points to the homicide stats, clearly, but it's also convenient because she also ignores the fact that everyday people in Boston are dealing with rising theft, break-ins, and assaults. And I mean, it's obvious. If local mainstream news stations are reporting on these things, then something is happening. The public is reacting to these things, and it's forcing them to do that. Now, let's talk a little bit about Boston's economy. On a surface level, you could say it looks strong, but there is, I would say, some warning signs that potentially indicate some issues, and here's why. So Boston is facing a commercial property tax shortfall of around $1.2 to $1.5 billion by 2029. And that is solely due to the decline of commercial real estate, which is around 35%. That means it's down 35%. So this inherently creates a, let's say, revenue gap, since a huge majority of tax dollars come from commercial properties. A large portion of the revenue in the city comes from this. So this in turn affects essential city services. So despite Wu's claim of, let's say, economic success, businesses are either fleeing or they're not coming here at all. They're going somewhere else. It's obvious. Look at the market, right? Then just recently, the Small Business Administration, which was located in Boston, is moving their office due to the sanctuary city policies, which is some levels of a signal of like some instability here, especially for small businesses that rely on federal support. The other thing is housing affordability. Housing affordability is at a crisis. It's been at a crisis, and take it from me, okay? So while Wu claims her administration's efforts in this area, the reality here is that there's almost 23,000 housing projects and or units themselves that are currently stalled, leaving, let's say, thousands of families struggling to find homes. And that data is directly from Boston Planning and Development Agency. That's where that data came from. These aren't just like minor issues. This is a slow-moving disaster that could cripple the city in years to come. Furthermore, the stalled units, what happens is they contribute to Boston's housing shortage, which in turn exasperate the affordability issues. And under Mayor Michelle Wu's administration, she increased the inclusionary development policy. If you don't know what that is, it's IDP for short. And what she did was basically raise the affordable housing set aside from, I believe it was 13 to as much as 20% for projects with 7 or more units. So, of course, what happens here is the increase adds financial strain to the developers, who they basically need to offset the cost of the losses on the below market rate units with higher returns elsewhere. And normally, to put it simply, this discourages construction, and the developers will, I guess you could say, inherently charge more for the market rate units to offset the costs for the more affordable units. I hope that makes sense. They're trying to make up for that perceived loss because of the increase of the 20% affordability. That means that more affordable units have to be built. That's what that means. On top of that, if you start to look at some of the real estate data and real estate statistics per Link MLS, who is fantastic at providing these reports, the housing market is in disrepair. And I don't think she's doing anything to help that. Condo sales declined by 2% on average in 2024. That's within Boston. But the median price, which most people are buying in, is up by 8%. So that means things aren't getting any more cheaper, okay? And if you look at some of the specific markets like Back Bay, they're down on average 16% in 2024, okay? The office vacancy rates are around 20%, and the market is struggling to adapt to, let's say, this post-pandemic reality where people are working from home, the attendance downtown is low, and you could tell that because if you look at the MBTA, it's at 70% of the pre-COVID levels of riders. So there's less people that are using public transportation. Now, you would think that increased inventory should, in theory, help buyers, but affordability remains out of reach for a huge majority of people because home prices are still high historically compared to wages. So where's the new housing? I mean, where is it? They've been even the governor has been talking about this. I don't see any new housing. So while she has claims of making housing more affordable, the market is still volatile, and her administration has yet to address the root cause effectively. And they're just putting things and roadblocks in place to make it less affordable for the average person. And, you know, I also think the mayor, want you to believe that Boston public schools are thriving. But again, the data tells a different story. I looked at reports from BPS. They're facing significant challenges despite what she says. She's giving an optimistic portrayal, but enrollment is on the decline. Kindergarten to second grade is seeing a 13.4% drop for the class of 2034 compared to the class up to 2024, and a 20% decline across all grades over the past 3 decades. And there's probably a couple reasons for this, COVID being one of them, but this reduction will eventually ends up straining funding as BPS maintains, let's say, under-enrolled schools, while the federal pandemic relief funds, they're eventually drying up, not only here, but also other towns, based on what people have told me. So this simultaneous decline in overall enrollment is also magnified by the effect of increased high-need student enrollment, which in turn provides challenges for BPS for resource allocation and trying to maintain education quality. So a huge tell here is that Boston Public Schools, as you might know, have announced plans to close several schools due to declining enrollment. And also, you could blame some of that on aging infrastructure as well. So perhaps maybe they're looking to consolidate some of these schools, so on and so forth. But again, it's a problem. Then there is the climate agenda. Now, I just did a podcast with Leo Gabriel, who is an engineer, and we talked a lot about this. But as you know, we're all feeling the strain of the cost of energy here. It's all throughout the state. It's not only Boston. However, Boston's climate policies, they come with a massive price tag for the consumer. Any effort to cut emissions and transition to green energy, they drive up costs on the front end, which is the building end, and also on the back end, which is the usage. It ends up costing more money, okay, both on the front and on the back. I hope that makes sense. And the city's building emissions reduction and disclosure ordinance, it's called BERDO, okay, that's what it's short for. What they do is that they mandate strict energy efficiency standards for buildings. And in turn, it's forcing property owners to invest in costly retrofits. And in turn, those expenses ultimately can be passed down to renters and or the homeowners in the form of higher rents or higher building costs. You can't have one thing without the other, okay? You can't have the energy efficiency without increasing the cost somewhere. And look at the utility rates. They're astronomical, and they just keep climbing. And that's, again, not isolated to Boston. It's almost the entire state, unless you're on some levels of independent energy, whatever it may be. Now, we have some transportation changes as well. Just recently, I don't know if it was 2 or 3 days ago, now they're buying electric buses. And they're also expanding the bike lanes, which of course requires taxpayer funds. So let me just sum this up for you here, guys. I think that Wu's claims that, she won't be bullied or Boston won't be bullied, I think she's simultaneously doing the same thing. She's doing the bullying in the guise of progressive policies. She's leaving the residents and the systems scrambling to bear the burden of her ungrounded promises with a ridiculous gap, right? A ridiculous gap between her rhetoric and what is reality. And that's the way I see it. End of story. I think that's it. This is long enough. That's it for today's video, guys. I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.